Teacher Talking Sports, what it does with to how we live. And let's continue this series, MLB Mount Rushmores I've been doing, where I name the four best players in each decade, started with the 2010s. Today, I'm on the 1970s. I previously did MLB Mount Rushmore videos of best four players in each franchise's history, and the four best players at each position. All these are going in a playlist. You can check them out. But let's take a look at my 1970s Mount Rushmore, and I'll talk more about the players later in the video. But in alphabetical order by last name, we have Johnny Bench, Reggie Jackson, Joe Morgan, and Tom Seaver. Now, originally, I did not have Reggie Jackson on, and instead, I had Jim Palmer. Definitely a tough guy to leave off. I'll kind of explain more why I threw in Reggie Jackson. But some other honorable mentions include Carl Yastrzemski, Steve Carlton, Willie Stargell, Pete Rose, Rod Carew, Phil Niekro, Mike Schmidt, to name a few. Bunch of great players from the 1970s. But the four guys I named are the ones I included. So let's get into them a little more in depth. So starting with Johnny Bench. So Johnny Bench played the whole decade with the Cincinnati Reds, as he did his whole career. But in the 1970s, so from 1970 to 1979, Bench batted .267 with an .840 OPS, 132 OPS plus, connected on 290 home runs, 1,013 RBIs, 792 runs scored. Arguably the greatest catcher of all time. Was an all-star in all 10 seasons of the decade. Bench won MVPs in both 1970 and 1972. Boy, he wasn't just an offensive player. He won 7 Gold Gloves in the 8 Gold Gloves in the decade, the first 8 years from 1970 to 1977. 2 MVPs, both in 1970 and 1972. Also had 2 fourth-place finishes and a 10th place finish. So for the decade, Bench twice led the league in homers, 45 in 1970, 45 in 1970, 40 in 1972. Had 2 other seasons with at least 30 homers. 3 times led the league in RBIs, including 148 in 1970. 6 seasons of at least 100 RBIs, had a 108 runs scored in 1974. Also had 4 seasons of at least 30 doubles. For the decade, Bench was a 2-time World Series winner with the Reds. They won back-to-back World Series in 1975 and 1976, the latter of which Bench was named the World Series MVP. As I mentioned, just a stellar defensive catcher as well. I mean, look at 1972 threw out 56.4% of would-be stealers. The following year, 49.1%, consistently over 40% during the decade, never lower than 39.1%. Johnny Bench, again, arguably the best catcher of all time. I think in my eyes he is. 1970s was the decade he did most of his damage, even had a season of 100 walks. Johnny Bench is my first member of the 1970s Mount Rushmore. Originally didn't have Reggie Jackson on, but I did decide to include him. So Jackson played the first 6 seasons with the Oakland Athletics, 1 with the Baltimore Orioles, and then 3 with the New York Yankees. In the decade, Jackson batted .275 with the .870 OPS, 148 OPS plus, 292 homers, 922 RBIs, 833 runs scored, and 183 stolen bases. In 1973, Reggie Jackson was named the AL MVP while with the Athletics. He also had MVP finishes of 4th, 5th, and 8th in the decade. Twice led the league in slugging percentage, once in OPS, 3 times in OPS plus. Twice led the league in homers. He had 4 seasons of at least 30 homers and at least 23 homers in every season in the decade. 3 seasons of 100 RBIs. Led the league in runs scored as well with 99 in 1973. Also could run fairly well. 4 seasons of at least 20 stolen bases. Yes, he struck out a ton, especially for his era. Over 100 strikeouts in every season, but nonetheless one of the most dangerous hitters of the 1970s. And reason I decided to include him, due in part largely to Jackson won 5 World Series in the decade. Of course, the Oakland Athletics won 3 straight from 1972 to 1974, and then he won back-to-back World Series with the New York Yankees in 1977 and 78, and that's really when those two latter World Series, when he was nicknamed Mr. October for his exploits. He had 14 homers in the decade. Was both the 1973 and 1977 World Series MVP. Reggie Jackson, just an outstanding player. Yes, he struck out a ton, but nonetheless, guy I decided to include on my Mount Rushmore, and it was so hard leaving off Jim Palmer. But anyhow, next, Joe Morgan. Joe Morgan played the first 2 seasons of the decade with the Houston Astros and the following 8 with the Cincinnati Reds. For the decade, Morgan hit .282 with a .860 OPS, a 140 OPS plus, 173 homers, 720 RBIs, 1,005 runs scored, 275 doubles, and 488 stolen bases. Also, more than twice as many walks as strikeouts, 1,017 walks compared to 517 strikeouts. That's like 404 on base percentage. Morgan won back-to-back MVPs in 1975 and 1976. Also at MVP finishes a 4th twice and 8th. Won 4 straight Gold Gloves for his work at second base from 1973. 5 straight from 1973 to 1977. For the decade, Morgan led the league in on-base percentage 4 times, walks twice, triples once, and runs once. Had 7 seasons of at least 100 runs scored. Did have over 100 RBIs, 111 in 1976. Stolen base machine for the first 8 seasons of the decade. Morgan stole no less than 40 bases and twice stole 67 in a season. Had a little bit of pop in his bat as well. 4 seasons with at least 20 homers, including 27 in 1976. Morgan was a member of back-to-back World Series winners with the Cincinnati Reds in 1975 and 1976. Definitely one of the best second basemen of all time and the 3rd member of my Mount Rushmore. And let's end with probably I would say definitely the best Met of all time, that being Tom Seaver. Seaver pitched the first 7 seasons with the Mets, was traded in the 8th from the Mets to the Reds, and pitched his final 2 seasons with the Reds in the decade. For the 1970s, Seaver went 178 and 101 with a 2.61 ERA, 147 complete games, 40 shutouts. I mean, imagine those marks in today's game. It's not going to happen. 2,304 strikeouts and a 1.07 whip. Seaver won 2 Cy Youngs in the NL with the Mets in 1973 and 1975. He also had Cy Young finishes of 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 7th, and 8th for the decade. Was named an All-Star 8 times during the decade. Led the league in ERA 3 times, including a microscopic 1.76 ERA. In 1971, led the league in strikeouts 5 times. Each of his first 7 seasons in the decade, over 200 strikeouts, and also had 226 in 1978. Led the league in whip 3 times, had 2 seasons with under a 1 whip. Again, era wasn't as high in strikeouts, but 6 times led the league in strikeouts per 9 innings. Tom Seaver, again, one of the all-time great pitchers, really. His World Series win did come in 1969, so right before the decade, but I gave him the oh so slight edge over Jim Palmer as the best pitcher of the decade. But again, it was so hard leaving off Jim Palmer. But yes, let me know in the comments if you agree, disagree with my Mount Rushmore for the 1970s, the 4 best players in that decade. Tomorrow, we will look at the 1960s. Anyhow, don't forget to subscribe. Tell a friend, tell a friend, tell a friend to subscribe. Like the video, share the video, hit the bell for notifications. I'm out.